There's something about Esther that doesn't quite add up, because here's a woman who had every reason to stay silent, every excuse to protect herself, every justification to let someone else be the hero. And yet, when the moment came, when her entire people faced annihilation, she said 5 words that would echo through history. If I perish, I perish. Most people think courage means you're not afraid, but Esther's story reveals something far more profound. She was terrified. The ancient texts make that clear. Approaching the king, uninvited, meant potential death. Her hands probably shook, her heart probably raced. But she walked into that throne room anyway. And psychologists today are discovering that her transformation from passive orphan to decisive queen wasn't just spiritual, it was a complete rewiring of how her brain processed fear, identity, and purpose. Let's start with something most people completely miss about Esther's psychology. When we first meet her, she's fundamentally passive. The text says she was taken into the palace. She follows Mordecai's instructions without question. She conceals her Jewish identity as directed. This isn't weakness. This is survival intelligence. Esther was an orphan living in exile. Trauma researchers now understand that early childhood loss creates specific psychological adaptations. You learn to read rooms instantly. You develop what's called hypervigilant social awareness. You become exceptionally good at figuring out what people want from you and giving it to them because your survival depends on it. But here's what's remarkable. That same trauma that made her passive also built the foundation for her courage. Studies on post-traumatic growth show that people who overcome early adversity often develop extraordinary resilience, not despite their suffering, but because of it. Esther's orphan years weren't just backstory, they were preparation. The psychological turning point happens in chapter 4. Mordecai confronts her with the crisis. Haman has convinced the king to issue a decree. Every Jew in the Persian Empire will be killed. And Esther's initial response? Fear, hesitation. She explains to Mordecai that approaching the king uninvited could mean death. Now, some people read this and think Esther was being cowardly, but that completely misses what's actually happening psychologically. Her fear wasn't absence of courage, it was evidence of her sanity. She understood the stakes. She wasn't naive about the danger. And that's precisely what makes her next decision so powerful. Because after Mordecai's famous challenge, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Something shifts in Esther's brain. Neuroscientists would call this a reappraisal of threat. She stops seeing the situation through the lens of personal survival and starts seeing it through the lens of purpose. Go, gather all the Jews, she tells Mordecai. Fast for me for 3 days. Then I will go too. The king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. That statement, if I perish, isn't resignation, it's resolve. It's the moment when purpose becomes more powerful than self-preservation, and psychologically, this is one of the most significant transformations a human being can make. Researchers studying moral courage have identified 3 components that must align for someone to take heroic action. First, the intellectual component, you need strategic intelligence. Second, the emotional component, you need to be gripped by values that transcend self-interest. Third, the behavioral component, you need to translate conviction into action. Esther demonstrates all 3. Intellectually, she's brilliant. She doesn't rush in with accusations. She hosts 2 banquets, carefully timing her approach, managing the king's psychological state. She understands persuasion at a level that would impress modern negotiators. Emotionally, she's connected to something bigger than herself, her people, her heritage, the covenant God made with Abraham. That emotional connection gives her the strength to face death. And behaviorally, she acts. She doesn't just feel brave, she walks into the throne room. She executes her plan. She risks everything. But there's another psychological dimension to Esther that's absolutely crucial. Her identity. Integration. Think about the complexity of her situation. She's Jewish, but living as Persian. She's a queen but also an orphan. She's powerful but also vulnerable. She's been hiding her true identity, but now must reveal it to save her people. Modern psychology recognizes this as identity integration, the ability to hold multiple aspects of yourself together without fragmenting. Esther mastered what researchers call enculturation. She learned Persian customs, won the king's favor, navigated palace politics. But she never lost her core identity as part of God's covenant people. And here's where the divine destiny piece becomes psychologically fascinating, because the Book of Esther never mentions God's name. Not once. It's the only book in the Bible where God seems completely absent from the text. And yet, his providence is everywhere. Every seemingly random event, Vashti's removal, Esther's selection, Mordecai's position at the gate, the king's sleepless night, they all align perfectly. Scholars call this the hidden hand of providence, God working behind the scenes, positioning people for purposes they can't yet see. And this creates a specific psychological challenge for Esther. She has to act with courage, even though she can't see God's hand clearly. She has to trust that her circumstances aren't random, even though there's no burning bush, no audible voice, no miraculous sign. This is faith in its most mature form. Not faith that demands constant confirmation, but faith that acts despite apparent silence. Psychologists studying religious experience have found that this kind of faith that perseveres without visible evidence, actually builds stronger psychological resilience than faith that requires constant supernatural validation. Esther's 3 days of fasting before approaching the king weren't just spiritual preparation, they were psychological fortification. Fasting creates a physiological state that can enhance mental clarity and emotional resolve. It's a way of saying to your body and your brain, we're preparing for something significant. Get ready. And when she finally enters the throne room, something extraordinary happens, the text says. The king extended his golden scepter to her. She found favor. But notice what Esther does. Next, she doesn't immediately blurt out her request. She invites the king to a banquet. Then, another banquet. She's managing the psychological dynamics masterfully. This demonstrates what modern psychology calls emotional intelligence, the ability to read. People understand their motivations and influence them effectively. Esther knew that timing matters, that creating the right atmosphere matters, that people are more receptive to difficult truths when they feel honored and valued. At the second banquet, she finally reveals Haman's plot, and the way she frames it is psychologically brilliant. She doesn't start with accusations. She starts with vulnerability. If I have found favor in your sight, O king, let my life be given me and my people. She makes it personal. She connects the king's affection for her with the fate of her people. She creates a psychological bridge between his love for his queen and his responsibility to protect the innocent. And it works. The king is enraged at Haman. Justice is served. The Jews are saved. But let's talk about what this reveals about Esther's character, because character is where psychology and theology intersect most powerfully. First, humility. Despite becoming queen, Esther maintained remarkable humility. She continued to respect Mordecai's counsel. She didn't become prideful with power. Psychological research shows that humility is one of the strongest predictors of effective leadership. Humble leaders make better decisions because they're willing to listen, learn, and admit when they're wrong. Second, wisdom. Esther exemplified what the Hebrew scriptures call chokmah, practical wisdom, not just knowledge, but the ability to apply knowledge in complex situations. She understood human nature. She knew how to navigate power dynamics. She combined courage with prudence, which is the mark of mature wisdom. Third, selflessness. Esther was willing to sacrifice her life for her people. This is what psychologists call prosocial behavior at its highest level. She could have stayed silent. She could have hoped that somehow she'd be spared. But she chose to risk everything for others. And that kind of sacrificial love is the foundation of every great moral achievement in human history. Fourth, faith under pressure. Esther acted courageously, even when God seemed silent. She trusted that her circumstances had meaning, that her position had purpose, that her actions mattered in a larger story she couldn't fully see. This is what theologians call providence, God's sovereign arrangement of circumstances to accomplish his purposes. And here's where Christian theology adds a crucial layer to understanding Esther's story. Because Esther isn't just a hero, she's a type, a foreshadowing of Christ. Think about the parallels. Both were positioned by God for a specific moment in history. Both risked their lives to save their people. Both said, in essence, "Not my will, but yours be done." But there's a crucial difference. Esther said, "If I perish, and she lived. Jesus said, "Not my will, but yours," and he died. Esther's courage saved the Jewish people from physical destruction. Christ's sacrifice saved humanity from spiritual death. This is why Esther's story matters for Christians today. It shows us that God is always working, even when we can't see him, that he positions people strategically for kingdom purposes, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, that our circumstances, even the painful ones, might be preparing us for something we can't yet imagine. Psychologically, this creates what researchers call a narrative identity, the ability to see your life as a meaningful story rather than a random series of events. People with strong narrative identities have better mental health, greater resilience, and more life satisfaction. They can endure hardship because they believe it has purpose. Esther's story gives us that framework. Your position isn't random. Your challenges aren't meaningless. Your courage matters. You might be exactly where you are for such a time as this. But let's be honest about something. Esther's story also raises hard questions. Why did God allow his people to be threatened with genocide in the first place? Why did he work through such dangerous circumstances rather than just preventing the crisis? These are the questions that Christian apologetics must address, and the answer isn't simple, but it's profound. God doesn't always prevent suffering, but he does promise to be present in it. He doesn't always remove danger, but he does provide the courage to face it. He doesn't always make the path easy, but he does make it meaningful. Esther's story demonstrates that God's providence doesn't mean life will be safe. It means life will have purpose, even in exile, even under threat, even when you can't see the full picture. God is weaving together circumstances, positioning people, working out his covenant faithfulness. And that covenant faithfulness is the theological backbone of Esther's story. God promised Abraham that his descendants would be a blessing to all nations. He promised David that his line would endure forever. Those promises required the Jewish people to survive. Haman's plot threatened God's covenant promises, and God, working through Esther's courage, ensured those promises remained intact. This is why the book of Esther is read every year at Purim. It's a reminder that God keeps his promises, that his people will endure, that even when he seems absent, he's actually orchestrating redemption. So, what does all this mean for us today? What can we learn from the psychology of Esther? First, your past doesn't disqualify you. Esther was an orphan, an exile, a woman in a patriarchal society. She had every reason to believe she didn't matter, but God used her, precisely because of her unique position and experiences. Your background, your struggles, your limitations, they might be exactly what God wants to use. Second, courage requires preparation. Esther didn't just wake up brave. She fasted. She prayed. She planned. She surrounded herself with community. Courage isn't reckless. It's calculated risk, taken for something that matters more than safety. Third, timing matters. Esther didn't rush. She waited for the right moment. She created favorable conditions. She understood that how you do something is often as important as What you do. Wisdom knows when to act and when to wait. Fourth, use your influence for others. Esther leveraged her position as queen not for personal comfort, but for advocacy. She used her access to power to speak for those who had no voice. That's the model for how Christians should engage with whatever influence we have. Fifth, trust God's hidden work. Even when you can't see him, he's there. Even when circumstances seem random, they're not. Even when the outcome is uncertain, his purposes will prevail. Faith doesn't require certainty, it requires trust. Esther's story isn't just ancient history, it's a psychological and theological blueprint for how to live with courage in uncertain times, how to trust God when he seems silent, how to act decisively when the stakes are high, how to use whatever position you have for purposes bigger than yourself. Because maybe, just maybe, you're exactly where you are for such a time as this. And the question isn't whether you're qualified or comfortable or certain. The question is whether you'll have the courage to say, like Esther, if I perish, and step into your divine destiny. That's not just ancient wisdom. That's the psychology of faith that changes the world.